A fairly common example of web server misconfiguration is the server or the website being left in debug mode. So in other words, being left in a state that's designed to help the server admins or the developers figure out what's going wrong with a site and get verbose internal information about the way it's executing, and that mode making its way into the production system. Now there are all sorts of good reasons why that shouldn't happen. Performance is one of them. Frequently debug mode operates slower. But most importantly, in the context of this course, debug mode can have serious security ramifications. This is a great example, Patreon. Now in October 2015, Patreon suffered a major data breach. In fact, there are over 2 million subscribers to the service that had their personal information exposed. I was one of them. My data is in this breach. And clearly I'm not real happy about that, particularly given the reason it was exposed. And it's this. It was a website being exposed with debug settings. And in this particular case, it was a debug library for Python called Webservers, which was exposed and allowed the attacker to run arbitrary commands on the system. Now let me show you Webservers, because then we're going to look at something else that's quite interesting. So this is the library in question. It's a Python library that had been left on the Patreon website and was exploited by the attackers. Now there's not necessarily anything wrong with this library, but it's not meant to be in a location that can expose production data to the general public. And the thing about this as well is that this was a very well-known risk. So for example, there was this blog post written just the year before the breach. And in fact, they make it very clear here. Remote code execution on misconfigured systems using Webservers. And this is the problem. The tool was meant for remote code execution as a feature, as a debugging tool, not something that should be publicly accessible to an attacker to then exfiltrate data. And this is not just a problem with Patreon. Let me show you what I mean by that. Let me jump over to Shodan. And Shodan is a very powerful search engine that finds internet-connected devices. Now, that can be many different types of appliance connected to the web. And clearly, that also includes web servers. Now, here's what I want to do. Let's do a search for Webservers. Now, when this search runs, we'll get the results of web servers running this debug tool. And as we can see here, there are a lot of them. And we know it's running Webservers because it's returned in the response header. And as I've said in many of my Pluralsight courses before, you really don't want to return anything in the response header you don't have to. In this case, it's found nearly 18,000 instances of this debug framework running on publicly facing websites. Now, it's not immediately clear how many of these are production systems and how many are immediately exploitable in the same way that Patreon was. But it would be fair to say that of that 18,000, there's going to be a significant number that are at immediate risk. And this is a great illustration of just how broad this problem is. Because like Elmar in the previous clip, Webservers is just one framework for one technology stack, and we've got nearly 18,000 results. Debug settings belong in non-production environments, preferably isolated from the public web. They definitely do not belong in any system that can expose production data, and Patreon is a perfect example of that. So that's debug settings. Let's now go and have a look at some excessive access rights.